90% of America's fresh tomatoes have long hailed from Mexico, quietly fueling a border-spanning trade worth over $3 billion, until July 14, 2025. On that sweltering day, without warning or a word of caution, the U.S. government slammed a 17% tariff on every imported tomato from its southern neighbor. There were no drawn-out debates, no somber speeches, just a sudden government directive and a resounding silence from officials. Weeks later, the effects crept into everyday life with bruising speed. In Raleigh, North Carolina, tomato prices catapulted upward by more than 40%. Scenes became familiar across the country. A mother in a local store reached for a tomato, hesitating as she weighed its new price, before reluctantly placing it back. Salsa, a staple for many restaurants, vanished from menus overnight. School salads, once vibrant, now appeared colorless, stripped of their trademark reds. Shoppers across America found themselves united by a single, unspoken question: what just happened? Beneath the surface, this disruption had nothing to do with farming efficiency or fairness. It marked a rupture, in trade, in trust, and in the politics of food. The humble tomato had become a political flashpoint. With one policy stroke, the U.S. administration scrapped the 2019 Tomato Suspension Agreement, a crucial trade accord that for years steadied prices and maintained a fragile equilibrium between the two nations' agricultural sectors. The pact had acted as a release valve. When tensions simmered, it cooled negotiations and kept tomatoes flowing predictably onto shelves. But in July 2025, that valve was shut off. There were no consultations, transition periods, or exemptions for goods already in transit. Tomatoes already loaded on trucks, already careening north on highways, were instantly subject to the new tariff the moment they reached the American border. Chaos ensued in the supply chain. Importers described the move as a blindside, economists labeled it reckless, and grocers saw it as a looming crisis. 2 months hence, U.S. tomato prices surged by as much as 45% in some cities. In Raleigh, beefsteak tomatoes leapt from $2.99 to $4.35 a pound. In Los Angeles, Roma tomatoes, once a bargain under $1, soared past $3.80. That wasn't just inflation. For many families, it was a razor slicing into tight budgets. Salads disappeared from school lunches. Fast food joints swapped their crisp, fresh salsa for mass-produced paste. In suburban kitchens, families watered down tomato sauce, coaxing it to last another night. But the economic aftershock extended far beyond the checkout lane. In Florida, dozens of small, Latino-owned import businesses folded within weeks, unable to absorb the sudden cost surge. With them went hundreds of jobs: warehouse workers, truck drivers, farm liaisons, people who had spent lifetimes building bridges between American demand and Mexican supply. In an instant, they were cast aside. There were no press conferences or compensation offers, only locked gates and thin envelopes marked severance. Even trade pundits, seasoned in the seesaw of agricultural policy, were stunned. They had anticipated negotiations, perhaps retooling of trade terms. But this overnight 17% tariff, unheralded, unplanned, was outside their models. Market analysts soon projected that the collapse of the tomato supply chain would seep into adjacent sectors: packaging, refrigerated transport, logistics. Small businesses up and down the food distribution corridor braced for impact. Many could already feel the rumble. The rationale from Washington was blunt: protecting American farmers. But who was really being protected? Florida's tomato fields yield crop for only part of the year. Northern states, like New York, Illinois, Minnesota, lean nearly entirely on imports to stock shelves. California, once a titan of tomato production, has watched its yield shrink for a decade, battered by drought and labor shortages. As shoppers paid higher prices and products vanished from menus, a more pointed question emerged. Was this policy about saving farms, or sending a message? And as a fruit turned political, it asked Americans to confront whether the promise of protection was worth the price at dinner. As the initial shockwaves of the tariff reverberated through American households and businesses, a quieter but no less significant battle was unfolding beyond the U.S. southern border. Mexico, faced with a sudden and brutal tariff wall, chose not confrontation but ingenuity. Without fanfare or threats, their response was strategic and precise. Rather than clamor for retaliation or hurl diplomatic barbs, engineers and logistics experts began quietly constructing a new trade artery, a tunnel beneath the turmoil that would redefine North American produce trade. In only 3 months, a rail corridor emerged that bypassed the United States entirely. Trains loaded with fresh tomatoes, berries, and peppers now depart daily from Bio, Mexico's agricultural heartland, weaving through northern Chihuahua before veering east into Ontario and Quebec. This network sidesteps American customs tariffs and bottlenecks, offering a cold chain marvel that keeps produce chilled between 1 degree C and +1 degree for a 2,000 kilometer journey. The result is remarkable. An extended shelf life of 4 to 5 days, less spoilage, fewer rejected shipments, and most critically, reduced transport costs. Reports from Canadian Pacific Kansas City, CPKC, confirm that this rail route chops logistics costs by 15% compared to the traditional trucking routes funneling produce through U.S. distribution hubs. What began as a supposed temporary workaround quickly morphed into a strategic pivot. Canadian supermarket giants like Loblaws and Metro didn't merely observe these new supply lines, they embraced them. Touring farms from Guanajuato to Jalisco, they anchored their confidence with 5-year contracts, locking in Mexico's produce through 2030. What is striking is how quietly this shift occurred. No rallies, no posturing, just a stream of refrigerated rail cars crossing a new continent-spanning corridor. Mexico had not just circumvented a tariff, it had effectively outmaneuvered it. As one senior trade advisor in Ottawa put it, they didn't fight the tariff, they outgrew it. This logistical recalibration has deeper implications than mere transport routes. Trust and reliability, two often overlooked currencies in trade, have migrated northward alongside tomatoes. Traditional U.S. importers are losing ground to Canadian ports and cold storage facilities. On the Mexican side, investment follows certainty. New refrigerated warehouses bloom near Montreal and Toronto, staffed and operating at full capacity well into 2026. Meanwhile, in American border towns like McAllen, Texas, warehouses close and workers lose jobs, 74 in 1 month alone at a tomato distribution firm. By late 2025, the statistics tell a clear story. Bloomberg Green projects that by 2026, nearly 48% of Mexico's fresh tomato exports will flow north to Canada, up from below 1% just 2 years prior. This shift extends beyond tomatoes, encompassing strawberries, avocados, and bell peppers, all threading through Canada's optimized cold chain and distribution network, bypassing the United States entirely. For American consumers, the rise in tomato prices was immediate. By July 2025, wholesale prices on imported tomatoes had jumped 22%, exacerbated by unpredictable inspections and federal enforcement. Many retailers describe this environment as roulette with perishables. Compare that with Canada's new average prices, which remain roughly 8% cheaper per crate thanks to smoother logistics and predictable routing. The human cost of this trade realignment is stark. Families like Maria's in New Jersey no longer can afford fresh tomatoes, opting instead for shelf-stable canned beans to feed her 5-year-old son. In Texas, retired workers like Tom find fresh produce aisles turned into luxury sections beyond their means. And across Detroit, SNAP-dependent families have quietly excised fresh salads from weekly meals. This reality is more than a price hike, it's a symbolic rupture. The tomato, once a commonplace ingredient, has become a marker of the tangible consequences when trade policy becomes a gambit rather than a crafted agreement. The most vulnerable bear the burden of decisions made in capitals they seldom influence. While America's tariff was framed as a protective measure for domestic agriculture, the complexity beneath this claim is undeniable. Florida's limited growing season, dwindling Californian yields, and widespread reliance on imported stock question the efficacy of such tariffs. Critics argue the policy neglects the real challenges faced by U.S. farmers: climate change, labor shortages, and water scarcity, issues the tariff does nothing to address directly. Then came the global fallout. Mexico's reorientation sent ripples beyond North America. Logistics firms in Rotterdam and Hamburg began forging new cold chain routes from Brazil to Europe, circumventing U.S. ports. Brazil formalized long-term organic vegetable contracts with the Netherlands, bypassing traditional American intermediaries. Colombia and Peru directed exports toward Canadian ports such as Vancouver and Halifax, sidestepping Los Angeles and Houston. East Asia's response was equally telling. In August 2025, delegations from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan arrived not in protest but in study tours to Cedero, Mexico, analyzing how the country rebuilt exports independently of the United States. Japanese and German firms are reportedly exploring Mexican electronics hubs to serve Asia-Pacific markets, operating within trade agreements that exclude Washington entirely. The message? Mexico's model of quiet resilience is being taken as a blueprint for the future. Canada, for its part, moved swiftly. By September, Ontario's AgriCorp began testing bilingual packaging lines that label Mexican tomatoes as Canadian under USMCA rules, a subtle legal workaround reinforcing stable supply lines. A Canadian official was blunt: "If the US wants chaos, we'll offer certainty." This quiet exodus from US-centric trade corridors, accentuated by a July 2025 European Central Bank memo warning of a strategic global shift away from America, suggests this saga is more than a supply chain tiff. It hints at a broader unraveling of trust in US trade reliability, a fracturing of networks that underpin everything from agriculture to advanced manufacturing. As the new trade corridors cemented themselves into place, the reverberations in the United States became impossible to ignore. The tomato tariff was no longer a mere trade policy, it was a symbol of a deeper rupture in America's global economic footprint. While Mexico and Canada cultivated stability and strategic alliances, American consumers and businesses grappled with unpredictability and rising costs. The human dimension of this shift cannot be overstated. Families across the nation found themselves adapting to a new reality where fresh tomatoes, a kitchen staple for generations, became a luxury item. Maria, the single mother from New Jersey, epitomized this silent hardship. Once purchasing fresh tomatoes every Sunday, she had since substituted them with canned beans, cheaper but laden with salt and preservatives, to stretch her limited budget and keep her young son fed. Retirees like Tom and Laredo recounted how the produce aisle now felt like an inaccessible specialty store. SNAP-dependent households, like Detroit's Wilson family, faced the grim choice of foregoing fresh produce altogether, eroding not just taste, but nutrition and dignity. This tariff not only altered eating habits but exposed cracks in policy conception. The claim of protecting American farmers rang hollow to many. Florida's seasonally limited crops and California's shrinking yields underscored the fragile nature of domestic production. Instead of investing directly in farm sustainability, addressing labor shortages, water scarcity, and climate resilience, the government chose a blunt instrument that inflicted pain on consumers and small businesses alike. Meanwhile, the global marketplace moved swiftly. The ripple effect from the US tomato tariff extended well beyond North America's borders. European ports in Rotterdam and Hamburg forged new supply chains from Brazil, entirely bypassing US gateways. Brazil secured multi-year contracts with the Netherlands, offering organic produce free from unpredictable American trade disruptions. Colombia and Peru redirected key exports toward Canadian ports, refining their routes outside US influence. Even East Asian economies took note of Mexico's strategic pivot. Delegations from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan visited Mexican agricultural and industrial centers, gleaning lessons on supply chain resilience and political neutrality. Japanese and German companies began eyeing Mexico's electronics hubs as launchpads for Asia-Pacific exports, capitalizing on trade agreements that intentionally exclude the United States. This quiet realignment suggests Mexico's blueprint is becoming a global model for countries seeking to safeguard commerce from political volatility. Canada, meanwhile, capitalized deftly on the situation. By instituting bilingual packaging that legally designates Mexican produce as Canadian under USMCA rules, Canada provided importers and retailers with a politically and logistically stable alternative. The contrast was stark. Whereas US trade policy fluctuated with political winds, Canadian strategy promised consistency and durability, a priceless commodity in global supply chains. Analysts from the European Central Bank warned in mid-2025 of an accelerating strategic shift away from US-centric trade lanes. This tariff drama over tomatoes foreshadowed broader realignments that could affect sectors far beyond agriculture: semiconductors, automotive parts, biotechnology, and more. The world isn't boycotting America outright, rather, it is quietly circumventing the uncertainties of American policy with patience, precision, and permanence. What began as a tariff on a humble fruit is now emblematic of a potentially larger unraveling. The question, haunting policymakers, businesses, and consumers alike, is poignant. Is this merely a tomato war, or the first fracture of America's global trade dominance? For Americans, the choice becomes more than political slogans or narrow agendas. It is a choice between patriotic prices, paying more for a fruit that once was abundant and affordable, or practical groceries that nourish families without breaking budgets. This dilemma now defines more than the tomato aisle. It challenges the very frameworks that govern international commerce and domestic welfare. The U.S. government's decision, made quietly and enforced swiftly, has reshaped North American agriculture and signaled a tectonic shift in trade relations. Mexico's quiet resilience and Canada's strategic embrace stand in stark contrast to the confusion and cost borne by American families. What the future holds remains uncertain, but one thing is clear. In the world of global trade, certainty commands loyalty, and unpredictability breeds realignment. As this saga unfolds, it asks all of us to reconsider the true cost of protectionism, not only in dollars but in trust, dignity,